Welcome. Take It Up with Jessica Lee. I'm here with Andy Paul, who is the podcaster for a program called Sales Enablement and representing ringDNA also, which is a technology company providing conversational AI kind of analytics for improving sales. Andy, you are an impressive podcaster with a ton of experience, a very large following, and you've done a great job. So I wanted to invite you on the show to give us some tips and best practices around building awareness using podcasts. How do you build your leadership, followership, and how do you actually run the business to continue to grow that?
Sure. So, thank you for having me on. Yeah, I mean, the podcast was sort of an interesting venture. I tell people it's the most selfish thing I've ever done because to date, we've produced just under 800 episodes and we're producing 3 new episodes a week. And I said, where else do you get the excuse to talk to, nearly 800 really smart people and learn something from each of them and be able to apply it to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So it's as much as hopefully providing great value to the audience, I get a lot out of it as well.
Yes, I mean you are what, the number 8 on the LinkedIn list of the top 50 sales experts. You've written a couple of books already. So tell us what have you learned, lessons learned that you can share with us, given this current sales environment we're in?
Well, I think for better or for worse, for everyone, I think in sales is you have to be conscious of the brand of yourself. I mean, I know this drives lots of sales leaders nuts to think that their salespeople are thinking about this, but it is a fact that if you're a salesperson and you approach a prospect and you do outreach to them, email, phone call, whatever, is at some point they're going to look you up on LinkedIn. And that has become increasingly important. And so you're saying, the difference, if you assume, as I do, is because my experience has shown me that the first decision the buyer makes is why you, right? This person talked to me, why should I listen to you? Why should I invest my time in you? Why should I trust you? Why should I give you the power to influence the decision I'm going to make? So you could be the difference ultimately between winning or losing the deal. And you should presume that you would be. Mm-hmm. So just these little differences you can set up to set yourself apart from your competitors are increasingly important. And so, I wrote this nearly 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, in my first book, Zero Time Selling, that, you, the seller, are the front line of differentiation. And that's become even more important since then.
Tell us about your, how did you build the crowd that you have now? Because I know you mentioned LinkedIn. Yeah, LinkedIn has been a platform that has helped you a lot, but it was very different then compared to now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I sort of did it backwards. I wrote my manuscript for my first book and went to some publishers and went to some conventions or meetings about how to market books and how to publish books and so on. And everybody told me I'd done it backwards because I'd written this manuscript, but I had no social platform at all. I wasn't on Twitter. I wasn't on LinkedIn. I'm a member of LinkedIn, but I hadn't published a thing on it. So I had no platform. And sort of eye-opening, right? Because it's like no one knew who I was. And so at that point, it's just a matter of sort of being deliberate in several areas. One is if you want to build this brand, if you want to be perceived as a thought leader, then you have to have thoughts. That's sort of the first thing, is you have to have a point of view. And so much of what we see on LinkedIn today, in my opinion, is just sort of regurgitated content from other people, or it's fairly simplistic. And I think what we really want, and people are really clamoring for, is something original, right? Some new way to think about this act of selling that we've been doing for forever, and something that'll give me some insights as an individual, something that I can apply that resonates with me personally. And so again, you have to start with a point of view. What do you believe in? And have that reflected in the content you post, the original content you post, or the comments you make, or the things that you share. that are reflective of that. And if you do it on a consistent basis, and I think that really then becomes the key too, if you're consistent in it, then you begin to attract, assuming you've got value in what you're posting, you begin to attract an audience. And so that go ahead, I'm sorry.
Did you take the content from the book and just kind of feed it out there like every week?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, a little bit on my blog, and not so much on social. So I think LinkedIn for me really didn't begin to take off till I started the podcast. So I started the podcast in 2015, which was 3 years after I published my first book. And I sort of reached this point. I was doing a lot of consulting for companies, and quite frankly, I was a little tired of it. And so I was at this conference. I heard this gentleman speak, John Lee Dumas, who runs this podcast called Entrepreneur on Fire, a very popular business entrepreneurial podcast, and was inspired by what he was talking about, just the idea of talking to people, learning these things, being able to share with the audience. And as that level, I think, of consistency with the podcast, because we start off doing 3 days a week, but pretty quickly moved to 5 days, 5 episodes a week, new episodes a week. That sort of consistency is really, in my mind, and it was quality content, drove the audience growth.
I see. Yeah, I think podcast is a new medium that kind of took off in the last few years with social media, enabling people now that we consume so much of content on the mobile phone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I find that it's hard to just try to read something on the phone. It's better for me to just listen or watch a video. And so I think video and podcast audio files are a lot more appealing. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it can be to some. I would say for people who are thought leaders, and I've had this conversation actually several times in the last couple of days with people that have podcasts and are wondering, okay, what can I do to sort of expand my reach? I really am a huge believer in books. And I think that one thing about a book is it forces you to crystallize your thinking about a topic in a way that just talking about it every day doesn't.
Mm.
When you have to commit it to paper,
yes,
and there's a little more permanence seemingly on paper, it's a different process you go through. And I think it's a necessary step for people to establish sort of a long-term presence as a thought leader is to document it in a book and force yourself to think, because it forces you to think it out more fully, right? If I have to fill 130 pages or 200 pages or whatever about a particular topic, I have to know it, right? I just can't be sort of this superficial expert that has, a couple key things I say every now and then. It's like, yeah, you got something you stand behind. So, and I think it's a problem that we have as a sales industry is that we don't have enough interesting new books being written by people under the age of 40. And so one of my passions is trying to mentor new voices in sales and encourage them to write books.
Well, writing a book takes a lot of time.
Yes.
And it's so much harder than just to put conversations together. I love having the conversation on podcasts. I do the video interview, and and I find that being able to learn from people out there from different roles, not just always talk to sales, but I talk to marketing and CIO, all kind of business responsibilities, and the audience that comes to the site enjoys having that broader conversation around different topics and being able to learn.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great way to learn, obviously, because I'm a huge advocate of podcasts, and so we're going to be at 800 here shortly, and probably less than a year we'll be at 1,000. So, yeah, I just think it's one great way to learn. I love listening to them when I run and so on. But at the end of the day, I think there's a depth of learning, and there's been some research about this, a depth of learning that comes from reading that you just can't replace. And sort of long form reading and yeah, so it's important to sort of address all of them. I think if you're a thought leader, is books, podcasts, if you can again come up with a point of view. And there are a growing number, everybody has a podcast, right? There's a growing number every day. There's more and more podcasts out there. How do you find your audience? how do you have the content that appeals to them so they'll come back on a consistent basis and listen, and how do you grow that audience? That becomes a challenge in a crowded environment.
And I would say that if you do end up writing a book, that you make sure it's got the audio option. Because
Yeah.
a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
us prefer the ebooks and
Right.
also the audio books.
Right. Yeah.
Part of the sales enablement best practices is being able to provide people different formats to consume the content, and having content in small bites. You can consume it at your own pace.
Yeah, well, and that's the beauty of a book. It's it's the downside of sort of a lot of our conventional training methodologies, is they tend to be sort of classroom oriented and gather people together for multiple days. And I think now with what's happened in the midst of the COVID pandemic, is you see so many training companies and thought leaders coming out with these online training platforms that are geared primarily around what you talk about, is how do we consume things in relatively small bites that make them more memorable, and are self-paced. And I think that's a great trend, and hopefully we actually expand on it, not go back to the way we've been with so as I said, classroom training. But how do we really incentivize our sellers to learn?
I want to shift and ask you about
Sure.
the current social tension around racial issues and pushing for progress and justice. The podcasts tend to be around business conversations, but I would say that a lot of people are very much thinking about the social challenges that's facing the nation, given all the protests and the riots. Have your speakers mention anything around their challenges in trying to figure out what's the right thing to do?
Not so much yet. I mean, there's been, on our show, we've featured a lot of conversations around trying to increase the opportunities for women in sales and in sales leadership. And so it's a topic that I'm passionate about, because when I started in sales decades ago, maybe as an anomaly, but we actually had a cohort of people come into this company I was with that was relatively equally split. I mean, it's more men than women, but it wasn't as dramatic a difference as we see today so often in Silicon Valley. And it's, as when I started the podcast, as one of the topics, I have a woman named Bridget Gleason, who was a co-host of a weekly episode we did on the show, who has risen to high levels in sales and SaaS companies. But as a topic we kept coming back to is why does it seem that we've gone backwards on this particular topic? And so we're trying to work with people that also are passionate about this. Lori Richardson, that runs a group, Women Sales Pros, and others. But how do we help managers understand that the opportunity they're missing by sort of just playing up to the stereotypical bro culture approach to sales, right? Things as basic as, how do you put your job descriptions together in such a way that you're using words that don't automatically make the job seem less interesting to women.
Right. Yeah. I think there are many things that companies are doing and it's shown to be effective, right? The words you use in the job description, the fact that you need to really seek out places where there are a lot of women candidates, and not just rely on your own personal network of friends that you know, because you attract mainly friends that are like you. Maybe if you're all guys, then you check all the guys. And I think that putting in place certain metrics as corporate metrics to achieve incentivizing sales managers to make sure that they are progressing towards those corporate goals.
Yeah, well, I think it's also a matter of mandates. I mean, I think that the companies have to commit and publicly commit, so they're held accountable for what they're going to do to change how they're practicing things. You can have something. I was hearing a conversation about the what they call the Rooney Rule in the NFL for teams when they have an opening at a head coach, and I don't know if it's only the head coaching level or if it also applies to the staff and in executive positions, but they have to agree to interview minority candidates, people of color, but they're not obligated to hire. There's no mandate to make a change. There's a mandate to make a show of change. I think that's a huge problem we have in sales as well. Is yeah, people talk about diversity, but there's very little in a very real sense. And so I think that for companies at this time, it has to move beyond the platitudes we put on a website and actually take action. Right?
Right.
What are you doing, even as small companies? What are you doing to change your practices, to be more inclusive, to bring diversity to the workforce? Because the diversity is, it's funny, it's not it's not, geez, let's do it and make a show of it. It makes a difference. I mean, when you bring people with different viewpoints and different life experiences into the fold, is they bring different things to the job that are beneficial.
So at
And
ringDNA, what's your gender percentage?
I and I say this because I'm relatively new there. I don't know. So I was there a week and a half when they went into shutdown mode,
Okay.
plus I was working remotely, and I work remotely, so I was only in the office for a couple of days. But I know the CEO says, look, we need to do better.
Mhm.
But I wish I had that information. Unfortunately, I don't have it at hand. But
Well, I'm sure
uh,
you'll be pushing for progress.
well, yeah, we have incredibly thoughtful CEO Howard Brown, who thought long and hard of this, and I said, as I said before we start recording, is unveiled internally the program that we're going to follow. Unfortunately, we haven't talked about it publicly, but it'll become public. And yeah, I couldn't be more proud of the thoughtfulness that went into it, the concern, the depth of feeling about wanting to make a change, and to be able to do better. And I think that it's something we all have to admit, is we could all do better.
Right.
And we're talking about this book I think we both read called Blind Spot: The Hidden Biases of Good People. And my wife recommended to me a handful of years ago, maybe 4 years ago, soon after it came out. And they were using it in some staff development work they were doing at, she works at the NYU School of Medicine. She's a dean and a professor there. And the conversation came up with her daughter, who is in med school, about these implicit biases are present, and they train doctors is that when they go into the examining room, that they could have, I think the number she gave was like they have about 24 biases that they have to sort of consciously filter through
Oh,
in order to really hear what the person is saying, right? I
tell me
mean,
some of that.
age, race, gender, jobs, where they live, just go down the list. And it's like, wow, right? I mean, and you think about that in the context of our daily lives, we all have that. And so the guys who wrote these book, the Harvard professors, developed what they call these implicit assumption tests, and really meant to surface sort of these, they call it hidden biases. They also call them preferences
Right.
in the book.
And I know we all have them. So
Oh, we all have them.
you
And
take this test, you'd be surprised of yourself, right? Oh my gosh,
mm,
it's
yeah,
it's
yeah.
surprising, but it's a good step to take to be aware of yourself, the biases you have.
Well, self-awareness is, so the first step of change, right?
Mhm.
Is you've identified a problem, and so yeah, I think anybody that goes and takes one of these tests, and they've been validated by millions of instances of people taking them, and you could take them over a range of topics. It could be race, it could be religion, it could be other social issues,
Mhm.
and encourage people to do that. You can search for blind spot on Google, and they'll also bring up the site at Harvard that does contains these links for these implicit assumption tests. And I think from both your personal life, and what you said in the context of what we're going through as a country, and trying to be uh, agents of change as opposed to just bystanders, it's an important first step. And I think that the lessons carry over also into business, because you have to communicate with a lot of different people, and these biases have a huge impact on how we hear what people are telling us,
Mm.
as well as how we communicate to people. And so I've been urging for you last several years in talks I give is and trainings I've give is, this is a book that should just be part of the core curricula that companies have, that their employees read, because it is so powerful, and it does require them to sort of reassess themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think during this time, at least the minimum companies can do, or leaders can do, is just to have an internal message to confirm their values and make it clear around equality, justice, and fairness. If not standing up publicly to talk about these things, at least at a minimum, you should reinstate your position
Right.
internally.
Well, and I think action, right? Action. That's really what needs to be done. And whether it's, again, as community level, whether it's, changing our policing policies, because we all have a role in that, and can participate. The things that are occurring, we just need to change. And I think the point of this movement that's occurring today is, one of them is that, it's time to stop sitting on the sidelines and being empathetic to what's going on. Is now, let's see what we can do to help make change.
Right, right. And I'm glad to see there are changes happening in a lot of cities, state level, and even now we've got federal laws passing for some reforms.
Yeah, but I think it's a local issue. It starts locally. So if policing is a local issue, so people want to get involved. How can you get involved locally? First of all, obviously you want to vote, but how else can you get involved to have these changes take place?
Right, right. Well, there's a lot of things to do.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get your tips on, in particular, about building the podcast fellowship and
Sure.
sales enablement and
Sure.
what's going on. So.
Yeah, well, I think, for us, the podcast growth has just been organic. And the key for us, and I read something recently I think was really wise, is that, it's not always about the sheer number of people that listen to your podcast. Is it the right people, right? So, we actually started, I say we because my son was my partner in putting it together, our goal was, how do we take all this interesting stuff that's happening in sales, and in large parts being driven by what's happening in the Valley, a lot of the innovations, a lot of the technology, and how do we help companies who are not tech companies, who are not in the Valley? How do we help them sort of come to grips with it and learn about what's going on, help them apply it to their business? And that lasted a little while. What we found is that, our audience still mostly came from the tech-oriented or tech-driven communities, right? When you look at the demographics, we're heavily concentrated on the two coasts, which is where you'd expect most of the sort of tech and tech-enabled businesses to be. So we didn't really shift our emphasis. It's just we sort of started attracting that audience more and more. And also we started attracting, pretty heavy management level audience. And that's due to a couple things. One is we spoke to a lot of CEOs, a lot of founders of companies, and wanted to talk about their stories. But also just the depth of conversation that we have made the podcast stand out. And partly is due to, the advice I give people is if you're going to do a podcast, if you're really serious about it, is don't rely on a set of 10 questions that you ask every guest that comes on the program, but do your research. What's unique about this person? What story do they have to tell? And engage them at a level that perhaps they're not being engaged by other people. So I think research really becomes really critical. If you're interviewing an author, read their book. Again, I stand out, I think, from other podcast hosts because I actually read the books of the authors when they come on. And I think it's the least you owe them to do that. And so we've sort of like to believe we've had this differentiated product that we're offering in the podcast that's a little more serious, a little more in depth, a little more insight that you'll gain from it because people are more spontaneous. I don't share my questions ahead of time that I'm going to ask guests. I don't take their questions. Oftentimes, guests want to come with questions. I don't take questions. We do it all, tailored for each person coming on. And I think it reflects that in the quality of conversations and what people think they get from them.
Okay. These are all very good tips.
Well, yeah, it takes a commitment though, right? I mean, a lot of people want to do podcasting, and that's, I'm not criticizing it, but they want to do it at a certain level, make it a little more easy. They don't have to prepare this, want to get guests on and talk with people. And that's fine. I mean, I heard early on from somebody, I forget who it was, but somebody was listening to my podcast, and this was within the first month or so of episodes that we had produced. And he said, Andy, it's good conversations, but we need more of you in there. And so I think the other thing for people in podcasts is you're not really there to interview people, though you can certainly do that. Is, in my case, I'm there to have a conversation with them.
Right.
And it's not just hearing what they have to say, as I'm going to express my opinion as well. And so when I get feedback from people that listen to my podcasts, it's as much about the insights that we sort of co-created together with the guests, as opposed to just the guest saying something interesting.
Right.
And I think that's the real value. So you can't be afraid to put yourself, you are the star of your own show. It's not your guest. I mean, it's you. And
that's what you're talking about, building your own personal brand, right?
Right. And that has to come through. Mm-hmm. And but here, people on podcasts and people starting them, and they're just, they're having a conversation, but it's a little too superficial. It's, don't be afraid to go deep. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid to reveal something about yourself. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable, because really people are going to come back and listen, not because of the guests. They're going to come back and listen because of you. Right. If you take the example, people don't come back and watch Jimmy Kimmel night after night because of his guests. They want to see Jimmy, right? Or The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, or Stephen Colbert, anything along those lines. They're coming back to see the host. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you look at really successful podcasts, Pod Save America, the political podcasts. People come back repeatedly to listen because they've identified with these people. They've felt like they've built a relationship with them. And that comes from you as the host being, I said, open and vulnerable and sharing your own opinion.
Right. So then you can be more authentic. Yes.
Yeah. You're just not there reading a set of questions. and so I think that's, it's a level of commitment though, that not every podcast host is prepared to make. But I think if you're going to get into it and you want to say, look, I want to do this for a long time. We talked before this, everybody has a podcast, but it's at a podcast convention, I think it was 2 years ago. And the statistic at that time was that the average number of episodes that a podcaster produces before they quit is 7. Mm. So, it's not easy. And
you got to finance that work, right?
Or sure, right. You got to be able to set aside the time, and a lot of people do them as side hustles, and that's great. Mm-hmm. But it takes a commitment. And one of the things that I think people don't always sort of think about with regard to a podcast is it's like a TV program. It's, people want to depend on you being there at a certain time, a certain day. And if you set those expectations, then don't meet them, then people go elsewhere. Mm. And how do you get them back?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the agenda. What is your objective and the agenda and all that? So then it defines the strategy and the level of engagement.
It can. Well, I think it's certainly reflected in the conversation, yeah. But it's really that commitment, consistency. You'll evolve. It's just our podcast. I've evolved both in terms of my interviewing skills and in terms of the format of the show and what we do. We're continuing to evolve to try to, bring more information, bring more entertainment value even to people. Because I think, podcasts ultimately are sort of infotainment as much as anything else. And we're always sort of looking, we certainly have a lot more we can do in terms of the entertainment part of it, but they are interesting. People do love to listen to them. They stay with it for a long time based on statistics. They're not just tuning on for 5-10 minutes and going away, because we're a 35 to 45 minute show.
Right.
Not as long as some. I mean, some of the most popular shows now, podcast shows are over an hour long.
Wow.
So people aren't afraid to listen. I mean, the Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard, which is one of my favorites, the Joe Rogan show, and those are all longer shows.
Yes, yes. Well, Andy, I appreciate you sharing of your own experience of how to build this podcast successfully, right? So you're saying do your research to get deep into the conversation and don't just be purely an interview, but make it two-way conversation that you can add insights, build your own brand. So I appreciate you sharing the tips. Looking forward to working with you. There you have it. Take it up with Jessica Lee, Andy Paul, podcaster of the Sales Enablement with Andy Paul. Thank you for being on the show, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.